The abandoned hospital, a horror film location, turns into a nightmare. A group of college film students, eager to find the perfect location for their horror movie, hears about an old abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. Intrigued by its eerie history, they decide to explore the decaying building, hoping to capture the perfect atmosphere for their project. Little do they know, this seemingly perfect location holds far more danger than they anticipated. As the group steps into the darkened entryway, their excitement quickly fades into nervous anticipation. The hospital, long abandoned and forgotten, is a maze of peeling paint, rusted equipment, and empty hallways that echo with every step. The air smells damp and stale, and the walls are covered in graffiti, remnants of those who dare to trespass before them. The group's leader, Jake, a budding director with a passion for horror, starts leading the way with his camera rolling. As they make their way through the building, the atmosphere becomes increasingly tense. The sound of their footsteps reverberates through the silence, almost too loud, as if the building itself is listening to them. Then something odd catches the narrator's eye. A pair of well-worn sneakers, abandoned on the floor in the middle of a hallway. It's a strange sight in such a desolate place. "Why would someone leave their shoes here?" he mutters under his breath. They continue exploring, but the unease starts to grow. A few minutes later, another clue. A sleeping bag rolled up and neatly placed against a crumbling wall, as though someone had been using the space as a place to sleep. The air grows colder and the students exchange uneasy glances. Jake, trying to dismiss their growing concerns, jokes, "Maybe it's just a bunch of squatters." But his voice cracks slightly, betraying his own nervousness. The group decides to split up to cover more ground, with Jake and his friend Emily venturing further into the building. As Emily steps into a room at the end of a long corridor, she freezes. The room is filled with more bizarre and unsettling items, scattered belongings, food wrappers, and even a half-drunk bottle of water. It looks like someone has been living here. Suddenly they hear a distant thumping noise. At first it's faint, almost like the sound of footsteps. But as it grows louder, the tension skyrockets. They freeze, barely breathing. From the darkened hallway ahead, a figure emerges, a disheveled man carrying a baseball bat, his eyes wide and crazed. He stumbles toward them, growling under his breath, his movements erratic. He looks like he's stepped straight out of The Walking Dead, his disjointed, jerking motions adding to the horror. The group's adrenaline surges and they turn to run, but the man shouts something unintelligible, his voice a low growl. He raises the bat and with terrifying speed begins to chase them, his every step sounding like a death sentence. They race through the hallways, desperate to find an escape. As the chase intensifies, the group realizes they've been led into a dead-end hallway. At the far end, there's a narrow gap, about 6 feet wide, leading to an open window on the opposite side. It's their only chance of escape. Jake turns to his friend Adam, who is lagging behind. "You have to jump," he urges, panic rising in his voice. "We can't outrun him. We have to get out now." Adam hesitates, his face pale. The gap looks impossibly wide, and the fall on the other side could be deadly. But the sound of the approaching man, his crazed mutterings growing louder, forces Adam into action. With one deep breath, he takes a running leap, stretching his legs in an attempt to clear the gap. The seconds feel like hours as he hovers over the abyss, but just as his feet are about to hit the ground on the other side, his fingers scrape the edge. He makes it, but only just, falling into the dust with a heavy thud, his body aching from the impact. On the other side, Adam quickly scrambles to his feet, adrenaline flooding his veins. But as he looks back, he realizes he's left the rest of the group behind. Emily, who is stuck in the hallway with Jake, shouts for him to hurry. The man with the bat is closing in, his steps quickening as he gains on them. With no other choice, Adam bolts toward the exit, calling back, "I'll find a way to get you out." His heart races, but he knows he's the only one with a chance to escape. As he bursts through a set of double doors into a courtyard, the cold night air fills his lungs. He's free, but his friends are still inside. Meanwhile, Emily and Jake manage to barricade themselves in a small storage room, the sound of the bat-wielding man pounding on the door. They know they can't stay there forever. The question now is, how long can they survive in this nightmare before help arrives, or before the man finds a way in? As Adam looks back at the looming hospital, a chilling thought creeps into his mind. The figure they encountered, was he really alone? The hospital, once a place of healing, now seems to be inhabited by something far darker. And with every passing minute, the students realize that the horror they came to document is not just a story, it's their reality. Adam stands in the courtyard, his chest heaving with every breath. The old hospital looms behind him, like a dark monster waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to enter. His hands shake, and the panic from his leap across the gap begins to set in. He tries to focus on finding a way to help his friends, but his thoughts keep racing back to the man with the baseball bat. His face, wild with rage, flashes through Adam's mind. That's not the face of a simple squatter or prankster. It was something much darker. Panic gnaws at him as he sprints toward the road, hoping to find a signal to call for help. But there's nothing. No phone signal. The feeling of isolation is suffocating, and as he looks back toward the looming structure, a sense of dread begins to creep over him. It's as if the building is watching him, beckoning him to return. But there's no time to stand still. His friends need him. Inside, Jake and Emily are huddled together in a small, filthy storage room. The room is cramped, and the faint smell of mildew and rotting food makes their stomachs churn. They can hear the man outside pounding on the door with the bat, his growls and shouts echoing through the building. It's as though he's trying to break down their resolve as much as the door itself. Emily is visibly shaking, her breath coming in short gasps. We need to get out of here," she whispers urgently to Jake. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to break through." Jake's mind races. There has to be another way out. He scans the room for anything that could help. Old boxes, rusted pipes, a window. Anything that could offer a path to safety. He spots a small, cracked window at the far end of the room, hidden behind piles of discarded hospital equipment. It's barely big enough for them to crawl through, but it might be their only chance. "Over there," Jake says, his voice calm despite the panic that tightens his chest. "We can climb through that window." Emily's eyes widen as she notices the window too. She looks down at her legs, still bruised from earlier encounters with the building's jagged surfaces. She isn't sure she can make the climb, but there's no choice. They move quietly, trying to keep their footsteps muffled, but the sound of the man's bat hitting the door makes their hearts race. The door shakes with every impact, the hinges groaning under the pressure. Just as Jake is helping Emily towards the window, the door bursts open. The man with the bat steps inside, his wild eyes locking onto them instantly. His grin is twisted, as if he's savoring the hunt. The heavy thud of his boots echoing as he steps forward is the only sound that fills the room. "You won't get away," he mutters under his breath, his voice harsh and low. He raises the bat, ready to strike. In a split-second decision, Jake pushes Emily towards the window, telling her to go. He grabs a metal pipe from the corner of the room, holding it up defensively as the man approaches with the bat. Emily hesitates for only a moment, but she knows she has to get out. She climbs quickly through the window, her hands trembling as she pushes herself into the narrow opening. Her feet scrape against the edges, but she doesn't stop. With a final grunt, she pulls herself through and lands in the dirt outside. But Jake isn't far behind. As the man lunges at him, Jake swings the metal pipe with all his might. The bat collides with the pipe in a clash of metal, sending sparks flying. Jake stumbles back but doesn't fall. He knows there's no time to fight. With one last, desperate shove, he pushes the man backward and makes a run for the window. Jake's hands are bleeding from the sharp edges of the broken glass around the window, but the pain doesn't stop him. He pulls himself through the gap, barely squeezing his body past the jagged edges. Just as he feels the bat-wielding man lunge for him, he makes it to the ground on the other side, landing with a painful thud beside Emily. They're both breathing heavily, looking around in desperation. The building looms behind them, its dark windows like watching eyes. But there's no time to rest. They hear the sounds of heavy footsteps approaching. The man is still coming. Emily grabs Jake's arm. "We can't stay here. We need to run. Now." They don't look back as they sprint away from the hospital, their hearts pounding in their chests. The road ahead is a blur as they make their way toward the highway, their feet pounding against the dirt. But just as they think they've escaped, the ground trembles beneath them. The man is close. They can hear his labored breathing getting louder, his steps getting heavier. Adam, now back at the road, is waving frantically at a passing car, praying for someone to stop and help. He's about to give up when, finally, a truck pulls over. The driver, a grizzled old man with a thick beard, rolls down the window. "What are you kids doing here?" he asks, his tone gruff. "We need help," Adam pants. "My friends, they're still inside the hospital. There's a crazy man with a bat. He's after us." The driver looks wary but nods, grumbling something under his breath. "I know that place. It's not safe around here. Get in. I'll take you to the sheriff." They drive as fast as the old truck can go, the hospital disappearing behind them in the rearview mirror. As they approach the sheriff's office, Adam breathes a sigh of relief. They've made it, at least for now. But as they reach the sheriff's office, Adam looks at the others. Jake and Emily are silent, their eyes haunted by the terror they just faced. They know that whatever they thought was a simple film shoot turned into something far worse, and they can't help but wonder, was the man with the bat just a part of the hospital's twisted history, or is something darker lurking within those walls? As the sheriff prepares to head back to the hospital with them, Adam can't shake the feeling that they've only scratched the surface of something much more horrifying. The sheriff, who's seen his share of strange happenings in the area, looks at them gravely. "You kids should have never gone in there. That hospital's been abandoned for years, but strange things have been happening nearby for just as long. It's not the first time someone's gone missing in that place." Jake turns pale. "Missing? What do you mean? Who else is there?" The sheriff's face darkens. "There's more than just one person living in there. You've stumbled into something far bigger than you think. And if you think the hospital is abandoned, well, it's not." And with that chilling thought, the group realizes their nightmare is far from over. What began as a simple location scout for their film has turned into a terrifying journey, one that may have no escape. The abandoned hospital, it seems, is only just beginning to reveal its darkest secrets. The sheriff's words hang in the air, thick with dread. Adam, Jake, and Emily exchange uneasy glances. The idea that the abandoned hospital is not truly abandoned, that there are more people living inside, maybe even more dangerous than the man with the bat, sends a cold shiver down their spines. "We need to go back," Jake says, his voice steady, though his eyes betray the fear he's trying to mask. "We can't just leave without knowing what's really happening in there. We can't just walk away from this." Emily, her face pale but determined, nods. "We have to make sure no one else is trapped inside." But the sheriff doesn't share their resolve. "You kids don't get it," he says sharply, gripping the wheel tighter. "This isn't just some twisted joke. That hospital, it was closed down years ago after a series of disappearances, strange incidents, and rumors. People said the building was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who died there. Others thought it was a sanctuary for people who had nowhere else to go, but they weren't just hiding. They were living there, in the shadows. He pauses, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. I've tried to go in before. People have tried. No one comes back the same. Some never come back at all. Adam's stomach churns. He can feel the weight of the sheriff's words bearing down on him. He had thought the danger was over. They'd escaped. They'd made it out. But now it seemed like the hospital itself was pulling them back in. As the sheriff's truck approaches the hospital once more, the group sees it looming in the distance, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes. The air around it seems thicker now, almost suffocating. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and the sky is a deep shade of purple, casting long shadows across the grounds. Stay close, the sheriff warns, reaching for his rifle in the back of the truck. This place is like a labyrinth, and if you don't know how to navigate it, it'll swallow you whole. The group disembarks from the truck, their faces tense and grim. Adam is determined, though every nerve in his body screams to turn around and run. But they can't stop now. They need answers. The moment they step back inside the hospital, it's like entering another world. The air is colder, heavier. The faint smell of something rotten lingers, and every creak of the old building makes their hearts skip a beat. As they move deeper into the corridors, the sense of being watched intensifies. It's as if the building itself is alive, breathing with them, waiting for something. The group cautiously explores, sticking close to the sheriff, who seems to know these hallways like the back of his hand. The deeper they go, the more unsettling the place becomes. In one room, they find more of the odd, out-of-place items: shoes, food wrappers, sleeping bags, even photographs of people they don't recognize. A sense of unease starts to creep in again. Were these people once part of the hospital's staff, or were they patients who never left? The sheriff leads them to the lower levels, into the basement. It's darker here, and the air is thick with the smell of decay. They hear faint, echoing sounds, whispers, footsteps, the sound of chains rattling. It's impossible to tell, but the tension in the air is palpable. They reach a room at the end of the hall, hidden behind a rusted door. The sheriff hesitates before pushing it open. "This is where it all started," he says quietly. "You'll understand everything when you see it." The door creaks as it opens, revealing a dimly lit room filled with old medical equipment, broken glass, and decaying paperwork. In the center of the room lies a large, rusty metal table, stained with something that looks like old blood. The walls are covered with strange symbols, some of which are barely legible, smeared in what might be dried paint, or something worse. At first, it seems like just another creepy part of the hospital. But then they notice the photographs, hundreds of them, covering every inch of the walls. They're all faded, yellowed with age, but what stands out are the faces in the photos, their faces. Adam, Jake, and Emily stare in disbelief. The photos are old, but there they are, with the same expressions they had when they first entered the hospital, as if someone had taken pictures of them from the future. "I told you," the sheriff murmurs, his voice barely audible. "This place doesn't just trap people, it keeps them here, and it keeps their souls." A sudden bone-chilling noise echoes through the room, an inhuman growl. The group spins around, but the room is empty. Then the sound grows louder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seem to move, taking on strange, twisted shapes. "Get out of here!" the sheriff shouts, his voice now full of urgency. "Now!" But it's too late. The door slams shut behind them, and the hospital seems to come alive, its dark corners and decrepit walls shifting as if to trap them. Figures emerge from the shadows, pale, gaunt, and silent, their eyes hollow. The people who were once part of this cursed place are still here, not just as shadows, but as something much worse. Their forms are flickering, like they are caught between worlds, unable to move on. The man with the bat, the same one who had chased them earlier, appears from the darkness, his wild eyes now filled with fury. He steps forward, raising his bat as if to strike. "Run!" the sheriff yells. "Don't look back!" Jake, Emily, and Adam sprint toward the hallway, but the hospital seems to stretch endlessly, as if it's purposefully elongating itself to keep them trapped. The shadows chase them, and the growls grow louder. The Bat-wielder isn't the only threat now. They're surrounded by these tormented figures, their faces twisted in silent screams. Just when they think they're finished, Adam spots an emergency exit at the far end of the corridor, glowing dimly. "There," he shouts, "the exit!" They race toward it, the sound of footsteps and growls closing in behind them. The door bursts open with a forceful push, and they tumble out into the night air, gasping for breath. Behind them, the hospital stands silent once again, as though nothing had ever happened. They don't stop running until they're far from the hospital grounds, the distant, looming building disappearing from view. As they finally collapse on the side of the road, the sheriff, panting and covered in sweat, looks at them gravely. "I tried to warn you," he says quietly. "The hospital is not just abandoned. It's a prison for the lost souls of those who once walked its halls. Those who try to leave, they become part of it. You barely escaped, and I fear you won't be the last." The group is silent, unable to comprehend the full weight of what they've just endured. But as they look back one final time, the faintest whisper seems to come from the wind, as if the hospital itself is calling them back. It's not over. The hospital is waiting, and it won't let them go so easily. Hospitals are places where stories of life and death unfold, but they are also the custodians of strange secrets, mysteries that only those who work the night shifts can truly appreciate. These secrets are not always easy to explain. Sometimes they defy logic and reason, but they are felt deeply by those who experience them. Nurses and doctors in the stillness of the night whisper tales of things they've seen, heard, or felt in the quiet corners of these hallowed walls. It's during these overnight shifts, when the rest of the world is asleep, that the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural often blur. The atmosphere of a hospital at night is unlike any other. The corridors are empty. The only sound the monotonous hum of machines, occasionally punctuated by the soft shuffle of slippers or the sighs of exhausted staff. The air seems to carry a weight, as if the walls themselves are holding on to the countless stories they've witnessed over the years. A sense of calm, mixed with an undercurrent of unease, settles in. And it's in this eerie silence that the strange stories of hospitals take root, stories that continue to haunt those who work long into the night. One such night, Dr. Williams was on duty, working the night shift on a nearly empty medical floor. This floor, typically reserved for patients in critical condition, had only a handful of patients that night, each of them hanging on to life by a thread. Among them was Mr. Peterson, an elderly man in his late 80s who had been in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. His body was stable, but there was little hope. The doctors had all but given up on him, and his family had already said their goodbyes. He had been unresponsive for so long that everyone had prepared for the inevitable. The end seemed imminent. Yet that night, as Dr. Williams made his rounds, a sense of unease lingered in the air. The hospital, as usual, was quiet, eerily quiet. But there was something different about the atmosphere tonight. As he walked down the long hallway toward Mr. Peterson's room, he noticed a faint sound. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whispering coming from somewhere down the hall. At first, he thought it was just the usual mechanical noise, the beeping and buzzing of hospital machines. But as he listened more intently, he realized that it was something else entirely. The whispering wasn't coming from any machine. It was as if someone was speaking very softly, almost to themselves, in the distance. Dr. Williams felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't just the chill of the cold hospital air, it was the sensation of something strange, something unexplainable, lingering just outside of his understanding. His instincts told him to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand. But something in the back of his mind kept tugging at him, urging him to investigate further. He shook off the unease and continued down the hallway toward Mr. Peterson's room. As he approached the door, the whispering faded, but a heavy silence hung in the air. He paused for a moment, glancing into the room through the small window in the door. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the room, and for a moment he saw nothing unusual. But as he pushed open the door and stepped inside, he froze. There, in the bed, lay Mr. Peterson, awake. The old man's eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural. It wasn't just the fact that he was awake after being in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. It was the eerie calmness in his gaze, as if he was looking beyond the room, beyond the walls, into something that no one else could see. "Mr. Peterson," Dr. Williams asked, his voice shaking slightly. He had seen many things in his years of practice, but this was different. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The elderly man slowly turned his head, his eyes locking with the doctor's. For a moment there was a blankness, as though he didn't recognize the doctor. But then, as if something clicked in his mind, Mr. Peterson's face softened and he whispered, "She's waiting. She's leaving us tonight." The doctor's heart skipped a beat. He looked around the room, half expecting to see someone else there, but the room was empty. "Who's waiting, Mr. Peterson?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Peterson's gaze shifted, his eyes focusing on something just over Dr. Williams's shoulder. His expression was serene, almost peaceful, as though he was seeing something the doctor couldn't. "She's here, waiting for me," he said, his voice growing fainter, as if speaking to someone beyond the room. Dr. Williams felt a sudden chill creep over him. It wasn't just the temperature of the room. It was the feeling that something was present, something unseen, yet very real. He resisted the urge to look over his shoulder, but a shiver ran through him. The atmosphere in the room had changed, shifted into something unfamiliar and unsettling. It was as though Mr. Peterson's words, though whispered so faintly, had unlocked something in the air, a presence that couldn't be explained. The doctor stayed for a few moments longer, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But no answers came. The whispering, the eerie calmness in Mr. Peterson's eyes, and his cryptic words. Everything about this night felt out of place. As he left the room, Dr. Williams couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just occurred, something he would never be able to explain. He looked back at Mr. Peterson one last time, and for the briefest of moments he thought he saw the old man smile, as if knowing something that no one else could ever understand. That night, as Dr. Williams made his way back to the nurse's station, the whispering returned. But this time it wasn't from down the hall. It was right behind him, faint but unmistakable. "She's waiting." The hospital, with all its stories of life and death, had just added another strange chapter to its long, mysterious history. And as the night shift dragged on, Dr. Williams couldn't help but wonder, who was waiting? And what had Mr. Peterson seen in those final moments that the rest of them had missed? From the machines. It was too deliberate, too soft, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. It sent a chill up his spine. Dr. Williams paused in his tracks, straining his ears to catch any coherent words. He stood there for a moment, in the quiet of the corridor, trying to dismiss the sensation creeping over him. The hospital had been known for its strange occurrences, lights flickering on their own, doors creaking open without explanation, patients murmuring in their sleep about things no one else could see. But this felt different. It wasn't just an odd sound. It felt like something was out of place. Something was watching. He shook off the feeling, deciding it was just fatigue, and proceeded to Mr. Peterson's room. As he approached the door, the whispering seemed to grow fainter, as though retreating into the shadows. His mind raced through various rational explanations: a malfunctioning speaker system, a nearby patient murmuring in their sleep. But nothing seemed to add up. He opened the door to Mr. Peterson's room with his usual quiet care. The room was dimly lit, the soft beeping of machines providing the only company. Mr. Peterson's frail form lay motionless in the bed, his body covered in sheets, his eyes closed. It was the same scene he had witnessed day after day, but something was different. Dr. Williams felt a strange unease as he stepped closer to the bed. As his gaze landed on Mr. Peterson's face, his heart skipped a beat. The elderly man, who had been in a deep coma for nearly 2 weeks, was staring up at the ceiling, wide-eyed and awake. "Mr. Peterson?" Dr. Williams whispered, his voice shaking slightly. He leaned closer, unsure of what to make of the situation. The man's eyes flickered in his direction but did not focus entirely on him. Instead, Mr. Peterson's gaze seemed fixed on something beyond the doctor, as though he was seeing something that wasn't there. The doctor hesitated, his heart racing. He reached out and placed a hand on Mr. Peterson's arm, feeling the warmth of life coursing through his skin. "Mr. Peterson, can you hear me?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. To his shock, the old man's lips parted, and in a raspy, fragile voice he murmured, "She's leaving us tonight." Dr. Williams froze, unsure whether he had heard correctly. "Who is leaving, Mr. Peterson?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but his mind was spinning. Mr. Peterson's gaze shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as though focusing on something just behind the doctor. He spoke again, this time with more clarity, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's waiting. For me." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning but completely unfathomable. Dr. Williams felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but the room was empty. The silence was suffocating. "Who are you talking about, Mr. Peterson?" Dr. Williams pressed, his curiosity and concern growing. Was this some kind of delirium, or was Mr. Peterson seeing something beyond the physical world? But the elderly man simply smiled, a serene, peaceful smile, as though he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. His eyes, though clouded with age, now seemed filled with understanding, as though he had been given a glimpse into a world beyond the one they occupied. "She's here. She's been waiting for me," Mr. Peterson whispered again, almost lovingly, his voice fading. Dr. Williams watched in silence, a sense of dread creeping over him. The room, which had once seemed so sterile and empty, now felt charged with an energy that he couldn't explain. The whispering he had heard outside the door suddenly made sense. Was it the voice of this mysterious woman Mr. Peterson had been speaking of? Who was she? Why was Mr. Peterson so calm, so ready to let go? Just as Dr. Williams was about to speak again, Mr. Peterson's breathing grew shallow, and his eyes closed once more, as though he had been given a final moment of peace. The faint whispering that had filled the room earlier died away, leaving only the soft beeping of the heart monitor and the silence that enveloped the room. The doctor stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Had Mr. Peterson truly seen something? Had he been in touch with something beyond this world, or was it simply a product of his delirium, brought on by the days of unconsciousness? He couldn't be sure. As he left the room, his mind was still spinning, trying to find logical explanations for what had just occurred. But deep down he knew that sometimes some things could never be explained. Hospitals, after all, were places where life and death intersect, where the line between the known and the unknown often blurred, leaving behind stories that defy explanation. And as Dr. Williams walked back down the corridor, the whispering seemed to follow him, soft, distant, and unsettling, as though the hospital itself held on to its secrets, waiting for the next person brave enough to hear them. Dr. Williams felt a strong shock. Mr. Peterson, whom he had mentally prepared for the almost certain death, was now waking up. His eyes were wide open, but they did not look like those of a conscious person. His gaze was absent, as if he were looking at something only he could see. The feeling was indescribable, like Mr. Peterson was trying to communicate with some world, a world that only he could perceive. "Mr. Peterson," Dr. Williams asked, his voice slightly anxious. He leaned over, trying to get Mr. Peterson's attention, but he only stared at the ceiling, his eyes following something out of reach. With a sense of unease, Dr. Williams gently placed his hand on Mr. Peterson's arm, feeling the warmth from his body. Despite being in a coma for a long time, his body still showed signs of life. In that moment, Dr. Williams felt as if something sacred was present in the room. He asked again, more softly, "Mr. Peterson, is something wrong?" At that moment, Mr. Peterson slowly opened his mouth, and in a hoarse, weak voice he whispered, "She will come. She is waiting." Dr. Williams could not understand these words. "Who is she, Mr. Peterson? Who is she waiting for?" He could not hold back the curiosity and growing fear inside him. Mr. Peterson gently turned his head, his gaze fixing on a point behind the doctor. It was not the gaze of a patient. It was a serene look, as if he were seeing something that no one else could. The whole room fell silent, and Dr. Williams sensed a strange shift in the atmosphere. It seemed as though there was an invisible presence in the room. Dr. Williams felt his entire body stiffen, as if an electric current were running through him. Mr. Peterson wasn't just staring into space. He seemed to be looking at something very specific, something the doctor couldn't see. The feeling grew more intense by the second. Dr. Williams felt a wave of coldness sweep through the room, and though nothing physically had changed, the atmosphere felt heavy, as if an invisible figure were standing nearby. "She's waiting for me," Mr. Peterson repeated in a hoarse voice. "She won't leave me alone anymore." Dr. Williams's heart began to race. Mr. Peterson's words echoed like a prophecy. It seemed as if he was speaking about an event that was about to happen, something beyond human comprehension. The doctor couldn't tear his gaze away from Mr. Peterson's face, and the strange feeling grew stronger. Dr. Williams wanted to ask more, but he couldn't bring himself to. A sense of fear was rising inside him, and he couldn't make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, Mr. Peterson lifted his head and looked directly at the doctor. His eyes seemed different now. They were bright, full of awareness. But they weren't the eyes of a patient awaiting death. They looked as though they were seeing something from beyond this world. "Doctor, she is waiting here." Mr. Peterson sighed, and in that moment the room seemed to darken. The faint light from the wall lamp seemed to grow dimmer. Dr. Williams felt an indescribable strangeness. He turned around to look around the room, but there was nothing to be seen but cold walls and the sound of machines still humming. However, that feeling, the feeling of an unseen presence, remained. The creepy experience of a 29-year-old nurse with an obsessive patient. The story of this 29-year-old nurse begins like any ordinary day at the hospital, where she was caring for patients. However, things took a strange and unsettling turn when she encountered a patient named Edward Dawson. He was admitted for a leg injury, but from the moment the nurse first interacted with him, she sensed something was off about his behavior. Edward's intense, mysterious gaze sent a chill down her spine. Though the hospital received many unusual patients, Edward stood out like a star with his peculiar actions. His constant staring and invasive personal questions about her life made the nurse feel deeply uncomfortable. After being discharged, everything seemed to return to normal, but this was just the surface. Edward wouldn't let go. One day, while the nurse was working, she received a sudden text from an unknown number. "You have such beautiful eyes, Emily. I can see so much through them." It was Edward. He not only found a way to contact her, but also started sending texts containing personal details she had never shared. These messages left her feeling terrified, unable to understand how he knew these things about her. Soon, Edward's stalking became more apparent. He unexpectedly showed up at the hospital where she worked and even claimed that he had become a nurse and was assigned to the same hospital. This left the nurse completely confused and frightened. She began to feel as though Edward was purposefully following her everywhere, as if he was always around, watching her every move. Gradually, Edward's harassment escalated. She began receiving frequent messages where he referenced moments from her day, things she hadn't told anyone. She couldn't fathom how he knew these intimate details. One day, as she was driving home after a long shift, she noticed a figure standing on the opposite side of the street, not far from her house. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized it was Edward. He was standing still, just staring at her. From that moment on, Edward's messages became more frequent and even more terrifying. She felt as if he was monitoring her every step, not just at work, but in her personal life too. One evening, while out with friends at a bar, she received an alert from her home security system. Edward was wandering around her house. At this point, her fear was unmistakable. Her friends urged her to call the police immediately. At a friend's house, the nurse and her friends watched the security footage. The situation grew tense as they saw Edward trying to break into her home. He attempted to open a window, climb onto the roof, and even tried to force the door. The fear surged, but they remained patient, waiting for the police to arrive. When the police finally showed up and arrested Edward, it felt as though the nightmare had come to an end. However, what the police discovered about Edward was even more chilling. It turned out that he wasn't a doctor or a nurse, as he had claimed. He was an imposter who had used the situation to gain access to her personal information from her medical records. It was horrifying to realize that he had been gathering personal details about her without ever being detected for a long time. After this traumatic event, the nurse could never forget the feeling of being watched for so long without realizing it. The strange messages, the unexpected encounters, and the fact that Edward knew private details of her life made her feel deeply violated. What had happened not only haunted her, but also forced her to confront serious questions about safety and privacy in the very profession she had always loved. This story is not just a warning about stalking, but also a reminder of the hidden risks involved in working in environments that may expose individuals to sensitive information. The relationships between doctors and patients, between nurses and those they care for, can sometimes develop into connections that are not easily predictable, and closeness in a professional setting does not always guarantee safety. This experience will forever be etched in the nurse's mind, and it serves as a lesson for all those working in healthcare. Ensuring privacy and maintaining vigilance in the face of unusual situations are essential aspects of their daily work. A nurse's chilling encounters with the supernatural and the dangerous. A 23-year-old nurse, still relatively new to the profession, was working in a hospice ward when she encountered Mr. Jacobson, a terminally ill, blind patient. His condition had long since deteriorated, and his prognosis was grim. He had only a few days to live. But what truly unsettled the nurse was not his physical state, but his unsettling behavior and eerie conversations. Despite his blindness, Mr. Jacobson seemed to have an unnerving ability to perceive things that were seemingly out of his reach. One evening, as the nurse was adjusting his IV, he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "Your grandmother is proud of you, Emily. She watches over you." The nurse froze, her heart skipping a beat. She had never mentioned her grandmother, who had passed away a few years earlier, to any of the patients. Yet, Mr. Jacobson had known her name. This wasn't the first time the nurse had been taken aback by Mr. Jacobson's cryptic comments. On multiple occasions, he spoke about life after death, recounting vivid details of what he described as the other side. His words were both comforting and deeply unsettling. He described the feeling of peace that would come once the soul passed on, a tranquility that he himself was waiting for. But the most chilling moment came when he started quoting her late grandmother. He repeated phrases that only the nurse's grandmother used to say, phrases that no one in the ward could possibly have known. How could this dying, blind man who had never met her grandmother speak with such intimate knowledge? The nurse couldn't explain it, but she could feel a cold shiver creep up her spine each time he spoke. While Mr. Jacobson's behavior was odd, it was nothing compared to the terror that awaited a nurse working in a mental hospital. This facility housed patients who had been deemed too dangerous for general psychiatric care. One of the most notorious patients was Jacob, a man whose violent tendencies were well known. He had been involved in multiple incidents of aggression, and it was a common protocol for staff to keep a careful eye on him. One evening, the nurse was assigned to check on Jacob. He was in his room, restrained, as was the standard procedure given his unpredictable behavior. However, when she entered the dark, cold storage room where he was kept, something felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the light overhead flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. Suddenly, Jacob's eyes, wild and filled with malice, locked onto her. Before the nurse could react, he broke free from his restraints with shocking strength, lunging at her with a scalpel that he had somehow managed to hide. The sharp blade glinted in the dim light, and the nurse, adrenaline pumping, barely managed to dodge the attack. She stumbled backward, heart racing, as Jacob advanced with frightening speed. She had heard stories of his violent outbursts, but the raw aggression in his attack was unlike anything she had ever experienced. His eyes were wild, almost inhuman, and his movements were fueled by pure rage. The nurse managed to call for help, and within seconds security and other staff arrived, subduing Jacob before he could cause any serious harm. But the encounter had shaken her to the core. The sheer intensity of Jacob's violence, combined with his unnerving gaze, left a permanent scar on her memory. He was later transferred to a more secure facility, where his violent tendencies could be more tightly controlled. But for the nurse, no patient would ever be as disturbing as Jacob. Both Mr. Jacobson and Jacob were unforgettable patients, but in vastly different ways. Mr. Jacobson's cryptic insights into life after death left the nurse with a sense of unease, as though she had brushed up against something beyond the natural world. His death, when it came, was peaceful, almost too peaceful, as though he had known something the nurse couldn't understand. He had said, "Death is not the end, Emily. It is a continuation. You'll understand when the time comes." On the other hand, Jacob's violent outburst was a stark reminder of the darker side of mental illness. His unpredictable rage, his ability to break free from restraints, and his overwhelming strength made him a figure of pure fear. The nurse could never forget the feeling of being trapped in the dark room with him, with no escape in sight. The incident had left her with a heightened sense of caution, and she would never enter a room the same way again. Both patients left an indelible mark on the nurse, each in their own way. Mr. Jacobson's eerie connection to the afterlife made her question the boundaries between the living and the dead. It was as if he had been a conduit for something beyond her comprehension. Was it possible that his near-death experience had somehow allowed him to tap into a world beyond our own? The nurse couldn't answer that question, but she would often find herself staring into the dark, wondering if there was more to the world than she could see. Jacob's attack, on the other hand, had made her more vigilant, more cautious around patients who showed signs of aggression. It had taught her the hard way that danger could strike at any moment from a person who appeared to be restrained and harmless. The nurse carried the scars of that encounter for years, both physical and psychological. She learned to respect the unpredictability of human nature, understanding that sometimes the most dangerous situations come when you least expect them. These two patients, one who spoke cryptically about life after death, and the other who brought terror through his violence, taught the nurse that her work in healthcare would always involve walking a fine line between the known and the unknown. Whether facing the supernatural or the very real dangers of a disturbed mind, she learned to trust her instincts, to be alert, and to never underestimate the power of the human mind. Her experiences with Mr. Jacobson and Jacob remained etched in her memory, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of the complexities of human existence. The living, the dying, the dangerous, and the unknown are all part of the same fragile web, and sometimes that web becomes impossibly thin. Unsettling encounters, the tech's mysterious stalker and the nurse's close call, the haunted phone calls of the X-ray technician. For an X-ray technician named Mark, life was usually quiet and routine. His shifts at the hospital were long, but predictable, filled with the standard tasks of taking images and ensuring the comfort of his patients. However, everything changed one evening when he began receiving mysterious phone calls. At first, they were just strange hang-ups, but as the days went on, the calls became more frequent and more unsettling. The voice on the other end of the line was always the same, low, breathy, and filled with a quiet intensity. "You don't know me, but I know you," the woman would say before hanging up abruptly. Mark thought it might be a prank at first, but the calls grew more disturbing with each passing day. The woman began to express anger toward him, accusing him of something he didn't understand. "I know what you did, Mark. You think I've forgotten, but I haven't. I'm going to make you pay." It was always the same voice, always the same cryptic threats. Mark tried blocking the number, but it didn't help. The woman would call again from different numbers, always finding a way to reach him. The fear began to gnaw at him. Who was this woman? Why was she targeting him? Then, one night, as Mark was winding down after a particularly grueling shift, he received yet another call. This time, the voice was much clearer, and it was full of fury. "I'm outside your house, Mark. You'll see me soon enough." His heart raced as he looked out the window. Nothing. The street was quiet. He quickly called the police, feeling a surge of panic as the minutes stretched on. At precisely 2 a.m., as Mark stood in his kitchen, still shaken by the call, a shadow passed by his window. He rushed to the door, looking out into the darkened street. There, standing just a few feet away from his front porch, was the woman. Her eyes were wide with rage, her face contorted in a mixture of fury and obsession. She began to approach, and Mark quickly backed away, grabbing his phone to call the authorities again. The woman, unperturbed, continued to walk toward him. By the time the police arrived, she had reached his front yard. They detained her without incident. As she was taken away in handcuffs, the woman screamed at Mark, calling him a liar and accusing him of ruining her life. Later, it was revealed that she had been stalking him for months, convinced that he had been involved in a tragic event years ago, a car accident that Mark had no memory of, nor any connection to. The woman, suffering from severe mental illness, had fixated on him as the source of her pain. Mark never understood how she had found him or why she had targeted him, but the terrifying experience left a permanent scar. He installed security cameras and alarms around his house, but the feeling of being watched never truly left him. The nurse's nightmarish close call. Nights out with friends were supposed to be an escape from the intensity of the nurse's everyday life. After long shifts at the hospital, a chance to unwind was exactly what Emily needed. But one fateful evening, her night of relaxation took a terrifying turn that she would never forget. It all started innocuously enough. Emily was having drinks with a few colleagues at a local bar. The music was loud, the crowd was lively, and for a while she felt at ease. But as the night wore on, she started to feel a strange sense of unease. Something didn't feel right. When she left the bar around midnight, the night air was cool and the streets were quieter. Emily walked toward her truck, parked a few blocks away, feeling the weight of the long evening as she glanced around the near-empty street. That's when she noticed a woman standing near a lamppost. The woman was staring directly at her, and as their eyes met, she gave Emily an almost unnerving smile. "Hey there, you look like you could use some company," the woman said, her voice slightly slurred, as if she had been drinking. Emily, somewhat startled, nodded politely and began to unlock her truck. As she did, the woman stepped closer, talking louder now, almost as if trying to distract her. "What's your name? Where are you from? It's so quiet tonight, don't you think?" Emily, trying to remain polite but sensing that something was off, tried to brush her off. "I'm sorry, I'm just heading home." But as she fumbled with the keys, the woman didn't back off. Instead, she moved even closer, and Emily's intuition screamed that something wasn't right. The woman's conversation felt forced, too intense, as though she was deliberately trying to keep Emily occupied. Just as Emily felt a chill run down her spine, she heard a noise behind her. Footsteps. She turned quickly, just in time to see a man, wearing a dark hoodie, creeping toward her truck. His eyes were fixed on her, and he was carrying something sharp. The woman had been distracting her while the man tried to sneak up from behind. Panic surged through Emily's body. She quickly dropped the keys and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door just as the man reached the side of her truck. Her heart pounded as she locked the doors and started the engine, her hands trembling. In her rearview mirror, she saw the woman step toward the man, but instead of confronting him, she simply nodded and smiled, as though their plan had been set in motion. Emily didn't wait to find out. She peeled out of the parking lot, narrowly avoiding a confrontation, and sped off. After the adrenaline rush subsided, Emily found herself shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't understand what had just happened. The pair had been trying to rob or harm her, and she had narrowly escaped. She didn't know why they targeted her, but it became clear that the area she had parked in wasn't safe. The next day, she avoided that part of the city completely and changed her routine. Both Mark's and Emily's experiences served as a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk just beyond the everyday. Mark's stalker had managed to fixate on him from the shadows, while Emily had narrowly escaped what seemed to be a premeditated attack. Both situations were unsettling in their own ways, yet the terror they caused had lingering effects. For Mark, the phone calls had shattered his sense of safety. He never felt quite as secure as he had before, constantly looking over his shoulder. The lingering fear of being watched became an obsession, and he took extreme precautions to protect himself. Emily, too, struggled to shake the paranoia of that night. She avoided her usual routes and stayed away from areas she had once frequented. Her once carefree nights out had become fraught with caution and suspicion. Mark and Emily both learned that danger can come from unexpected places, often when they least expect it. Whether it's a woman stalking you with cryptic threats, or a pair of criminals trying to harm you under the cover of darkness, the fear lingers long after the immediate threat has passed. For them, the lesson was clear. Always be aware of your surroundings, and never underestimate the danger that can hide in the most seemingly innocent of encounters.